Hey there, welcome to School of Emo, the podcast where we dive into the world of emo, pop punk, and everything in between. If you've ever found yourself in your car screaming the lyrics to Taking Back Sunday, wearing way too much eyeliner in the early 2000s, adding a buckle or a chain to every outfit you've put on, you are in the right place. I'm Erin Judge, and each week I will be your fellow student, guiding you through the music, the culture, and the history that shaped an entire generation of angsty teens. I am not the teacher of this school. I am a fellow student, here to learn alongside you and from you. Together, we will cover a lot of information that doesn't really matter, but will remind us of the days of stalking MySpace channels and getting lost in chat rooms. So connect your dial up, turn on your webcam, and let's go to School of Emo. School of Emo, we are back, and today we are talking about a topic that I've been thinking about for over a year now. I mean, I've been thinking about it for the majority of my life, but in the context of this podcast and this conversation, I've been wanting to have this topic highlighted, but I've been a little nervous to talk about it. I don't know why. We'll get into why. But I think now we've grown enough where there are people who can chime in because this is meant to be a conversation. I would love to have a room full of people talking about this together. And so I invite you in as we're talking today, as you're listening to me, pretend we're on the phone, like texting, throw in some of your comments, especially if you're watching on YouTube. You can comment on this actual episode and have a conversation with each other and with myself because I am very curious about what this is going to look like and your thoughts on this. And that is the overlap of Christianity, youth culture, and emo culture. So we're going back to the intersection of Christian youth group culture and the rise of that third wave of emo and post-hardcore, the scene in the early 2000s. And this is where like kids were moshing on Saturday, at youth group on Sunday morning, like hanging out with their friends, sharing music throughout the week. And though there was such a blend in what people were experiencing in their own like faith and in like this faith community, but also just youth culture as a whole. And I haven't been a part of Christian youth group culture since I was in it as a youth myself, which is like 20 years ago. But I don't know if it's the same as it was then. I can't imagine that it is. I think it was such a special period in time. So we're going to talk about how there were bands that were bridging this gap, what that looked like, and then some of the history behind it. And then I will share a bit more about my own experiences as a teen in Christian youth group world and my own entry into emo with this bridged gap. But I will also share some of my thoughts on this in the 2020s and in my 30s, and just kind of what I've seen and experienced myself throughout my relationship to this scene and even faith. And again, we are all going to have so many different experiences. You may have the exact same experience as I did. You may have a very different experience also coming from Christian youth group culture into emo culture in the scene. You may still consider yourself a Christian. You may have deconstructed, left the faith. You may have never been a Christian, but you saw this and experienced this in your own way. Or maybe you never knew that this was even happening. And this is all completely new news to you, even if you were part of the scene throughout the early 2000s. So wherever you're coming from, I hope you enjoy the conversation and join in on it. So to better understand this overlap and what was happening in the 2000s, we have to go back to the 90s a little bit. And so the late 90s, Christian alternative music was starting to really take off and become very prominent, even before that full like third wave kind of emo explosion happened. But sort of at the same point that like post-punk was sort of turning into this alternative world, like setting the stage for emo and like the alternative space, right? That was also happening within the Christian music space, kind of very cultural as a whole. And so we had bands like Strong Arm, MXPX, Five Iron Frenzy that were already kind of planting seeds of alternative music with spiritual roots in youth culture. And they didn't play worship music. It wasn't Christian radio, right? But they were infusing their faith, infusing the biblical language and themes into their music while it sounded like secular music. It looked like secular music. They toured with secular bands, like non-Christian bands. So they were in the culture, in the world, but their messaging was slightly different, offering kind of an avenue and a pathway for people who liked that sound, or even those who maybe weren't part of the Christian scene already, to have like an influence from that space. So kind of an very, very interesting, which isn't really, I think, defining something as Christian or not is probably problematic, and I think was a big failure for the Christian world as a whole, because music is meant to be reflective of beliefs and worldviews and values and experiences. So this was no different. It was just Christian band members doing that in a way that wasn't quote unquote Christian at its head, like Christian radio or worship music or gospel music that was available at the time. So we get into how this continued to grow, like from these bands on, just like emo grew. The youth culture of the time, the way you experience music is through your friends, your community, right? What is actually in your real world. We didn't have streaming at this time, right? We didn't have access to the amount of music we have now. We didn't have social media to the degree that we have now. You only knew about music if you heard about it from a friend and maybe bought it, or they had it and they shared it with you. Maybe it would find its way to radio, right? But even that was pretty rare. And so what happened was that Christian youth group communities began to share music with each other, and that began to take off with a lot of the bands that were around that period of time. So we had CDs, MTV was starting to kind of open the door, like, MySpace was starting to sort of open up, Livewire, but word of mouth was still the number one way to hear about new music. What also was happening around this time is that if we think about how you had to purchase music, right? Or steal it, but usually purchasing it in some degree. That's really how you became a fan of a lot of bands. Where was the money coming from if you were a teenager, preteen? You're not working, right? Where'd you get the money? Probably your parents, right? And so a lot of Christian households, especially around that time, I'm sure they still are today, the parents were pretty strict about what kids were listening to. I grew up in a very Christian conservative household, and my parents were as strict as they could be. There was a lot going on. It was very hard to be super strict. But I experienced this firsthand, and a lot of my friends experienced this as well. Like, my mom was not going to buy me a CD by a band that was fully secular, really. I had to have some sort of bridged gap of, well, they're a Christian band, but they look like this, right? The music had to be sold at a Lifeway Christian store. That already gave it a little bit of a check mark of, oh, I can buy this. Going to concerts. I couldn't drive. I'm from a rural small town, right? We had to travel if we wanted to go to a show, which is why we didn't really have a big scene in our town, and that's not something I have as part of my history. So who was driving me? Who was buying the concert tickets? Who was taking me? My mom. Was my mom going to step foot in a place that was not considered Christian? No. So these bands that were bridging the gap around this time that looked alternative, sounded alternative, were really alternative, but considered themselves to be Christian band members and aligned themselves with Christianity even a little bit, not using certain language in their lyrics as well. It opened the door for a lot of teens that grew up in similar households to mine to start coming into this kind of emo alternative space. And very different than like the punk space, right? We were on the Emo's Not Dead cruise, and Hawthorne Heights did this whole conversation about what is emo, the history of emo. And they made a statement that I thought was really interesting where they said, punk is us against the world. Emo is us against ourselves, right? Me against me versus me against the world. And that is really true. Like, emo is really rooted in introspection, vulnerability, raw emotion. Kind of, he mentioned it was like hating yourself, but the struggles internally, the struggles with self. And these bands, they weren't just us against the world. Some of them were with like Christian undertones, which a lot of Christian beliefs can be very us against others, which can be problematic. But a lot of the music was also like me against me, but with a me and God against me kind of thing. And so that was woven into it, and it fit really beautifully and made sense within the emo space. So just like the third wave of emo exploded in the early 2000s, we also saw preteens and teens dealing with the same uncertainties, the fears, the emotions, the exposure to the things around them, like 9/11, certain wars, right? Everything that really exploded for the emo scene and bands like Thursday, even My Chemical Romance. Teens across all parts of the culture were dealing with the same thing. And so that also created this perfect space and time for this kind of emo Christianity overlap to occur because teens, preteens were searching for something. And as a millennial, again, grew up in this period of time, we know that we began to be exposed to so many things in our world. And our parents, the generation before us, they were exposed to war. They were exposed to a lot of stuff. Our grandparents were exposed to the Great Depression, like pretty intense things, right? But there were filters between what all they were experiencing. We started seeing social media. We had TV expand to cover topics that were different, right? We had the internet. Like things began to really open up to the level of exposure we experienced about the things going on around us. It created a lot of fear. It led to this deep seated need to express and process what was going on around us in order to survive, in order to make it through, right? And I believe that our parents' generation did a good job of just surviving and shoving things down. Our generation decided, especially those who gravitated to this world, we decided that we wanted to express how we felt, which is what led to the emo explosion. That's where emo comes from, right? It makes you feel something and it allows you to express, and it became a pathway for that. And so, those who were dealing with this in the Christian environment were experiencing the same desire. And unfortunately, you would think that these like Christian church environments would open the door for this expression. And I think in some ways it did. And it provided hope. You know, there were messages of hope, of community, like all of that's really valuable and important and very foundational to even some of the things that I went through as a kid and how I processed a lot of this. But I think there was also a level of like a different type of shoving and masking in these worlds where, you know, in some churches, especially the one that I came from, there was this belief that like, okay, well, you confess your sins, you repent, and then you move on from them and you change and you go in this path, right? And it's all about like doing the right things. And then there's also this belief of like, well, God is bigger than all these other things. And so it's like, yeah, you're sad or this is scary, but God is bigger, God is better. And so there's this shift, right? And that can be good because that can be hopeful. Like it helps to put like hope in something bigger than yourself. Like I think that's valuable. And that's important. But I think that something can get missed whenever you have emotions, you have heartbreak, you have fear, you have uncertainty, you have anger. Like there's something going on internally, and you need to process it and be able to be heard and be honest in order to not just have that kind of eat away at you. If you're just masking that, like that doesn't always work and it can backfire. So I believe a lot of us that gravitated towards this kind of emo Christianity overlap in these bands and then expanded into the emo scene as we continue to evolve as humans, that's what we were seeking. And that's my experience. I was deeply emotional, deeply introspective. I had a lot of hard things in my childhood and I didn't know how to process them. And I grew up in a household that was very much, you know, we don't talk about it and like we move on. It wasn't the most nurturing. And we had Christianity, which was great, again, for some hope and, you know, belief and community. But again, that church I was in didn't provide fully the space and the safety to be vulnerable and to be emotionally expressive. So this was so well timed and very much a lifesaver for me and part of my entire development and who I became. So, what were some of the bands that were around this time that kind of were a big piece of this overlap in this big movement? The probably the most known and popular and maybe iconic in a lot of ways is Under Oath. You can go back to our episode where we did the deep dive on Under Oath if you're curious about the specifics around their history, especially if you weren't aware of this overlap. But they were one of the first bands to be very much in that post-hardcore space, like a lot heavier, that were like outspoken to be Christian. Now, their band wasn't necessarily labeled a Christian band. In the Christian world, it was. But they were outspoken as band members of being Christian individuals in a band and that their Christianity influenced their music and their performances. They talked about their beliefs on stage pretty explicitly. In some interviews around that time and beyond, keyboardist Chris Dudley has explained that the band members were Christian in their personal lives and that faith shaped how they handled things, even if every song wasn't a Bible lesson. So they infused some kind of biblical beliefs and ideals and some hope and all of that into their lyrics. They didn't use a lot of like cursing and certain language in their lyrics early on. Because of this, but it wasn't necessarily like worship music or Christian radio, kind of biblical music, right? But that positioning allowed them to connect with both Christian youth groups who would share their music at like Christian church events. They'd be played at youth group events, and emo kids who found something honest in their lyrics and the intensity that they shared. So their first big album from 2004, They're Only Chasing Safety, became very massive right in the middle of this emo mainstream Christianity overlap. Now, with their evolution, I think that's also really interesting to see how even this connection and divide between Christianity and emo culture has evolved, because the band members, some of them still consider themselves to be Christian band members and have maintained that. Some, outspokenly, Spencer, have left Christianity, deconstructed all of those beliefs, and their music is very different since the kind of call it a full breakup, if you will. Spencer leaving, Aaron leaving, like that big riff that they had, like Spencer's struggles with addiction and how the church really, like the church communities handled that, which was not well done at all or very Christ-like if you actually have read the Bible. But it led to that really shifting. So now today, you do not consider Under Oath to be a Christian band, right? But back then they were. And that also brought up a very interesting experience for fans, because there are still fans today that like and connect to early Under Oath, and that's how they found them, and that was the connection point. And they did not continue with the shifts and changes that Under Oath has gone through, because they've clung to that more Christian side of the overlap. There are fans that have grown in the same way as Under Oath, where they maybe identified with Christianity more when they were younger, and then over time they've deconstructed some of that, and their views have changed, and the way that they live life and experience have changed. And there are some people who never knew that there was an overlap with Christianity and maybe connect with them more now, and that's why, which is really interesting. So it's very complicated and nuanced, just like I think Christianity in the world and alternative spaces are right now. Another big band within this space was Amberlin. They're not often like a very like on the nose like emo band, but they were very big in the Christian emo overlap and continue to be kind of a big marker within that space. Even on the Emo's Not Dead cruise, Amberlin was there and very much loved, and has continued to be. In the early 2000s, they really were like core within this overlap and the connection to Tooth and Nail Records. So this was a label that was rooted in Christian and alternative music, and they weren't really a Christian label. They weren't within the Christian music scene, but they signed and produced a lot of bands within this overlap. So if you liked one band on Tooth and Nail, you probably found the rest of the bands on Tooth and Nail. And Amberlin was one of those big ones that was able to connect within kind of that Christian youth group world and really pull a bunch of people into the Tooth and Nail world. Frontman at the time, maybe still frontman, maybe not. Maddie Mullins may be in fully. Stephen Christian is open about his faith and has always been, but the band rarely positions itself as a Christian band. In interviews, he has said that he viewed faith as intertwined with his life, not something shoved down listeners' throats. So, a tightrope many of their fans related to. So those were not the only bands that were around. There were a lot of different bands that were in the emo, post-hardcore, kind of Christian overlap. Some of those included Further Seems Forever, which was one of Chris Caraba's projects that was very much more aligned with Christianity and faith there, kind of from the Dashboard Confessional space. Emery, more of that heavy post-hardcore, but still had those themes of personal struggle and themes of faith woven in. As Cities Burn, which was a Christian post-hardcore group that was mistaken for like screamo, so they were considered a Christian band but got pulled in. Flyleaf, a female-fronted Christian band, blending the scream and melody combos that felt very emo. They sang songs that then got turned into like worship songs. And some people in the Christian world like connect deeply from a Christian perspective to their lyrics, whereas some who are not Christian at all and never were connect deeply to the lyrics in a different way, which I think is really special. And they continue to be around in this scene, even though they haven't really made a lot of music. But Lacey is like one of the more iconic females within the emo world. Switchfoot, maybe more on that pop punk side of things, but in the alternative world that resonated within the full scene and definitely blended the gap, especially when it came to radio, MTV, commercials, TV appearances. Switchfoot took a lot of this kind of Christianity undertone into alternative mainstream very well. There were also bands like Mineral and Sunny Day Real Estate that were not strictly Christian label acts, but still seeped in spirituality into their more emo style music. And that really landed on youth group and DIY scenes alike. And then even looking at festivals like Warped Tour and Furnace Fest, these were spaces where these bands that had these Christian followers and Christian backgrounds were overlapping with the bands that did not, but were deeply like emo, screamo, post-hardcore, pop punk. So it was a space where the blend showed up because fans were coming from all perspectives and finding community with like-minded individuals in these different spaces. Within the Christian world itself, we had our own little festival that was like a little Warped Tour called Winter Jam that infused kind of alternative Christian music. So not just like worship music or radio music, but those that had more pop influences, hip hop influences, and more rock influences. So bands like Skillet, Toby Mac in the kind of hip hop space, some of those bands, that Pillar, being a big one. But it allowed a space for youth groups to go. And for me, that was something I looked forward to every single year because I couldn't go to Warped Tour, but I could go to Winter Jam. And so I had exposure to bands that made such a big impact on my life. Stellar Cart, Super Chick, I think Flyleaf was probably there at one point. But some of these bands that for me were my gap. They were my outlet, my avenue into what was actually more mainstream and part of youth culture, and very much connected. Now, my pathway into the emo scene that I'm more deeply involved in today in my 30s. So, what did this look like kind of on the ground? So, looking through some Reddit threads, some fans have said, Reliant K was my first emo pop punk band, and then I pirated Taking Back Sunday, that pathway. A lot of us listened to Emery or Under Oath at youth group. And then we saw them at Warped Tour and felt like we belonged in both worlds. Overlapping fandom helped make emo more inclusive, where your church friends could also be your pit buddies. So just a lot of opportunities for people to fit in, which is what kind of the emo alternative space is about. It's for the people who maybe don't feel like they belong to have now a space to belong and express and be safe and have community. This was the same within those who were also within this Christian culture as well. Thinking about my own experience on this as I've gotten older, I think this is really nuanced. I mentioned what I believed about my early experience and there being oppressive nature within Christianity. That might be too strong of a word, but a little bit in my world. And again, we all have our own experiences. Um, so this type of like the emo world opened up a lot of room and safety to explore, and the introspective side, learn about who I am, what I believe about the world, myself, how I experience it, how I move through heartbreak and struggle and pain and all of those different things. As I've gotten older, and especially into the 2020s, into my 30s, this has become even more nuanced and interesting, because if we look at especially American Christianity, this is not a spiritual faith podcast, um, but it's been complicated. And I know, I mean, we look at Spencer Chamberlain of Under Oath, the deconstruction of faith, and you know, coming to terms with that. Haley Williams of Paramore, same thing. She was a Christian, right? She grew up in like very much deep seated Bible belt right down the road from where I live. And she deconstructed that too, and is very vocal even in her music today about the very non biblical values within American Christianity groups, and how we might be finding some of those biblical values within worlds like the emo scene and the emo revival, the communities we find ourselves in at concerts, right? And at shows from bands that are not Christian and have never even claimed to be, but have been inclusive and looking out for the person that is oppressed and making room for, all people to exist, spreading love versus hate and division, right? All of these themes that should be found within these churches and communities that isn't always present. Um, and as someone who I've not necessarily left my faith, I am also in a process of deconstruction and reconstruction and figuring out what that means and what people I'm associated with, which is really important. And it's a little deep, but I think I experience emo music and lyrics. I know we don't always love talking about brand new, but Devil and God are like raging inside me. Like that album today means so much more to me, and is those lyrics hit very differently. The newer Under Oath music, like it all hits more than it would have as a teenager. And even in my 20s, like how I relate to that today is very unique and different. And I feel like I'm experiencing emo as it was intended to be. I mean, Thursday, full collapse, like going back to that album, I'm experiencing it in a way that I think it was intended to be experienced. Even My Chemical Romance, even what may seem kind of silly and be poppy in some way, like really getting into lyrics and emotion behind it and the vulnerability, like because of my own experience with faith and spirituality, and figuring that out in the 2020s. um, it's interesting, and it's nuanced, and it's complicated. And I think what we had in the early 2000s with this overlap in this youth group, that youth culture as a whole, like I wish we could all kind of go back to that for a minute. I do think some of it is naivety. Naivety. We were naive. We didn't know what we didn't know. And, the world of social media, the beauty of that is that we learn more about people and experiences, and world opens up and we learn a lot more. And ideally, the more we know, the better we become and we change. And I don't think a lot of people have. So to have that unity in some way, I think would be really beautiful. And maybe one day we'll get back to it. But what we see today is from that, because, if we look at where this gap started, because I'm even talking about this overlap of emo and Christianity from the early 2000s. And if you experienced it, you might be like me and like, wait, where did it go? Like, that was such a beautiful time and it just seemed to disappear. If you maybe didn't experience it, you might be looking at it with your experience today and thinking, like, how did that ever overlap? And we think about, later in the early 2000s, like 2006, 2008, emo as a whole, like there was kind of a war on emo. There were, a lot of homophobic stuff going on with the emo culture very strongly, leading to violence in a lot of areas, like in Mexico. Um, there was also this like belief that these people were demonic. You see that even today, where like pictures of Gerard Way performing on stage and the eyes change and he's demonic. There's that belief because of just the way people look. A lot of those people, like my mom's one of them, messages to me even today, not even listening to the lyrics or what people are saying, but just making assumptions based on how someone looks. Like Christianity in America became a lot of that, very othering, very much based on how you look, the vibe you give off, like very quick to label someone as demonic or wrong or sinful or whatever. And then there was also the kind of suicide side of it all, where there that was happening. Bands like Hawthorne Heights, My Chemical Romance, kind of thrown into these conversations about suicide in youths and teens, tied to lyrics. And I don't think that was necessarily new, but I think we were writing about it. Again, the internet opened up doors for people to share those experiences, and it became really complicated. And I think whenever that started happening, I do think that was around the time that we started seeing this big wedge and divide. We also started seeing bands that were becoming, in their 20s and dealing with really hard things like addiction and, facing that within that blend, and were completely torn apart by the Christian side or maybe even the emo side, and had to, pick a side and again join in that divide. So I believe that that's where that probably happened. And for some people, that blend has stayed true and they experience that today. That might be you, or you were part of that and you're still experiencing the blend perfectly well. You fully identify with Christianity and the emo culture, and those are the bands that you still gravitate towards. But we see a lot less of that, I think, with newer bands. We see a lot more bands that are very anti, like religion, because of everything and the nuance of it today, which is very fair. I understand that because it's complicated and people kind of suck, and use their religion, whether Christianity or not, as weapons for hate and divide. And that is not what emo has ever been about. So it does feel like you're kind of making a choice. Politics being thrown into it, American nationalism in the Christianity pipeline. Like there's just a lot of stuff there that is really complicated. And trying to figure out like why you see, again, sometimes more community and love and biblical values being upheld in like an emo scene in a concert over a church. Like that's really hard to work through as a person. And that's what I'm dealing with. And that's what I've experienced this as. And I'm so curious about experiences and curious about even my own introspection, and I've leaned into that even more. Like your 30s, your 20s, you feel like you know everything, right? Your 30s, you realize you don't know anything, and it's all about like what you can learn and figure out and curiosity. And I'm in that now within this space for sure, which is why I want this to be a conversation. So wherever you fit in with all of this, or like maybe your observation of it, or maybe this is the first time you've ever even heard of all of this overlap, or maybe you think it's all dumb and you don't agree with it at all. Maybe be nice. Like that's the whole point. Productive, right? We're here to be in community together. But share. I want to hear what you think. I want to have a conversation about it, because I wish we had a whole room of like people here to talk about this with this episode. Like that's what I would want more than anything. Unfortunately, I don't have that. So I'm here just doing what I can, and then letting this grow. But the whole point of this podcast is to connect and have conversations with people who are like minded in some ways, but also have different experiences that influence their perspectives and beliefs. So please share. That's your homework from today's class. Please share. And maybe if you were completely oblivious to this overlap, go listen to some of the early Under Oath, Amberlin, Reliant K, some of these bands, even Further Seems Forever, so that you can like really listen to the lyrics with this in mind and kind of understand like what we were experiencing as like a Christian youth within this period of time and how much this music would have meant to us. And then you can listen to later music from those bands and see if you can note how it maybe evolved and how band members possibly changed and evolved or did not. So that's your homework. And then I will see you in our next class as we continue to do our deep dives on bands that have shaped the emo culture.